Hey everyone, this is Utsav from Dropbox, and I'm going to be talking about test result caching. And what is test result caching? So are people familiar with like the remote cache of Bazel? It's one of the reasons why we use Bazel. And Bazel caches build actions, and that's one of the key selling points. But it also caches test actions, so things like the test results, the test logs, and the exit code. But the only difference with regular actions and like test actions is Bazel only caches passing test actions. So you don't get into a situation where a test failed and it's a flake, and it's really hard to get that result unstuck because Bazel cached the failed test. But if your test passes and you ask Bazel to run it again, and if everything works out correctly, it won't rerun your test, and it'll do this transparently. And we use this in our CI system. So why do we like test caching? So you can think of an example where we run some tests in pre-submit, and we also run tests in pre-release. And in some cases, what happens is Bazel realizes that you don't need to run the test again because the test already ran in pre-submit. So we can actually use that to say, you know what, we don't have to run the test, we can just fetch the results from the cache. And what we see is, we see like a 10 to 20% reduction in the number of tests we run every day, which is really good for efficiency. We also run into less flakes because we don't need to run a test again. How do we get to test caching? It's very similar to like build caching. We need to make sure all our Bazel rules are reproducible. So for the first thing was we migrated all of our rules from non-Bazel to Bazel, and that worked out, but they were not super reproducible. So if you ran Bazel build or Bazel test on a different machine, or if you ran them with a different output base, with a randomized output base, you would see not byte for byte reproducible output. So first we had to fix that. And to start that off, we just had like a large like bash file where you just run Bazel build on a bunch of targets with different output bases, and you can see that they're creating different outputs, and you can actually use that to fix bugs. And we've got some interesting bugs, and we found some breakages over the last few years. We tried upgrading like our Rust nightly toolchain at one point, and that didn't create reproducible Rust binary, so we actually reported that upstream. And how do you measure how useful test result caching is for you? So we use the build event stream. Are people familiar with like the build event stream of Bazel? So you can use that to say, was this test action cached or not? And then we populate that, and we can actually see that we have like 10 to 20% caching of our build results. Not all actions can be cached. So for example, some tests like Docker tests just cannot be cached, and that's just the reality we live with. And yeah, that's about it for my talk. What questions do people have? Yeah.
What remote cache are you using?
So we built our own remote cache implementation, still using like the HTTP, and we're thinking of migrating to like the gRPC version. So yeah.
And we will open source that tool?
We're not going to open source the caching implement, but it's pretty simple. It's just like multi-layer caching. Yeah. To repeat the question, so what remote caching solution are we using, and are we planning to open source it? Yeah.
How do you unstuck the cache if you get a bad output?
That's a good question. This has happened once in the past. So the question is, how do we unstuck the cache? And like if the cache gets poisoned? And the solution that we have is we have this one root key that we just change, which clears the entire cache. And that's how we unstuck it. It's really rare that there's a bug, but it has happened once for us, yeah. Yes?
Well, I think this is just a variation on that question maybe, but if
Yeah.
you have a flaky test that gives you a false positive that says, hey, this test is passing, and you cache it, have you thought about strategies for dealing with that?
Yeah, so what ends up happening is some dependency really like deep in the graph ends up changing, and tests run pretty often. So eventually the test gets uncached, and then we have a flake detection system that just, if a test just fails once, it tries rerunning it 10 times without caching enabled, so like dash dash no cache test results, and that ends up just saying something like we have to disable the test. Yeah.
Why can't a Docker test be cached?
That's a good question. I'm not really sure. I think the answer, so why can't Docker tests be cached? And it's because they talk to the Docker daemon, so they're not sandboxed. So we don't want to cache test results that are not in the sandbox.
It's
Yeah.
it's a conscious decision.
Yes.
not to do that.
Yeah. Because they're non-hermetic. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
What's your eviction policy?
What's our eviction policy? We just have a TTL. So the main cache backs out to S3 in the end, and we just kick it out of 90 days. But since things, again, change so frequently, most of the time you don't use cache outputs that are like more than a few days old. Yeah. Yep, thank you.